The young North Vietnamese soldier couldn't believe what he was seeing. Electric lights blazed across the American prison camp like a small city, brighter than anything in his rural village. Clean white buildings stretched in perfect rows. The smell of cooked meat drifted from a massive kitchen facility. This wasn't the torture chamber his commanders had described. Nguyen Van Duc had been captured 3 days earlier near the DMZ. Everything he'd been told about American brutality was about to crumble. What he discovered in the next 18 months would shatter his understanding of the enemy he'd been fighting. For years, North Vietnamese soldiers had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about American prison camps. Communist indoctrination painted vivid pictures of torture chambers where captured Vietnamese fighters would face starvation, beatings, and systematic brutality. The Americans were portrayed as barbaric imperialists who showed no mercy to their enemies. Le Minh Dao, captured in 1968, later recalled the terror that gripped him during transport to the prison camp. He expected to be thrown into a dark cell with no food or water. His training had prepared him for the worst possible treatment. Death seemed preferable to what awaited him in American hands, but when the truck pulled through the gates of the detention facility, something felt wrong. The guards weren't screaming or brandishing weapons. Instead, they processed new arrivals with methodical efficiency. Forms were filled out. Medical examinations were conducted. Personal belongings were cataloged and stored. Tran Van Minh, a former Viet Cong fighter, described his confusion during those first hours. Where were the torture devices? Where were the starving, beaten prisoners his political officers had described? The reality didn't match the narrative he'd been fed since childhood. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. These soldiers had spent years preparing mentally for capture, steeling themselves for the horrors they'd been promised. Instead, they found themselves in facilities that operated more like small towns than prison camps. American guards spoke to them in broken Vietnamese, attempting basic communication rather than intimidation. Medical personnel examined wounds and provided treatment. The contrast with their expectations created a psychological crisis that many POWs struggled to process. Pham Duc Loy, captured near Khe Sanh, later wrote about the mental gymnastics required to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he'd been taught. His commanders had insisted that Americans were inherently evil, incapable of showing mercy to Vietnamese fighters. Yet, here he was, receiving medical care from the same soldiers who had been shooting at him days earlier. The propaganda machine had been so thorough, so convincing, that many POWs initially assumed this humane treatment was part of an elaborate psychological trap. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the real brutality to begin. Some refused food, convinced it was poisoned. Others remained silent during initial interviews, expecting torture to follow. What they couldn't understand was that American military doctrine had evolved beyond simple brutality. The U.S. military had learned that treating prisoners well often yielded better intelligence than torture. More importantly, it served as powerful propaganda when word spread back to North Vietnamese forces still fighting. The systematic destruction of their preconceptions began immediately. Every meal served, every medical treatment provided, every basic human dignity respected chipped away at years of indoctrination. These weren't the monsters they'd been warned about. Some POWs experienced what psychologists would later recognize as a form of ideological whiplash. Their entire worldview had been constructed around the evil nature of their American enemies. When that foundation cracked, everything else began to crumble too. The most psychologically damaging aspect wasn't the comfort itself, but the realization that they'd been systematically lied to by their own leadership. If the Americans weren't the brutal torturers they'd been told about, what else had been false? This question would haunt many prisoners throughout their captivity and long after their eventual release. The medic's hands moved with practiced precision as he cleaned the shrapnel wound on Hoang Van Thuan's leg. Thuan had been shot during his capture, expecting to bleed out in some filthy prison cell. Instead, He found himself on a clean operating table under bright surgical lights, receiving the same medical care American soldiers got. Dr. James Richardson, the camp's chief medical officer, had seen hundreds of wounded Vietnamese prisoners pass through his facility. His orders were clear: treat enemy combatants with the same standard of care as U.S. troops. No exceptions. For Tuan, this was incomprehensible. Back home, medical supplies were scarce. Battlefield medicine meant dirty bandages and prayers. Here, American medics used sterile instruments, proper anesthesia, and antibiotics that most Vietnamese had never heard of. The surgical suite itself was a marvel that left many POWs speechless. X-ray machines revealed internal injuries with impossible clarity. Heart monitors beeped steadily, tracking vital signs in real time. Oxygen tanks and IV drips maintained patients during complex procedures that would have been death sentences in North Vietnamese field hospitals. Nguyen Thanh Son arrived at the camp with a badly infected arm wound that had festered for weeks. Vietnamese medics had told him amputation was inevitable. American doctors not only saved his arm, but restored full function through a series of surgeries that showcased medical technology he'd never imagined possible. The recovery wards shocked prisoners even more than the operating rooms. Clean white sheets were changed daily. Meals arrived on schedule, carefully planned to aid healing. Nurses checked on patients throughout the night, monitoring temperature and administering pain medication as needed. Pain medication was perhaps the most alien concept of all. Vietnamese fighters were taught to endure suffering as a mark of strength. The idea that pain could be simply eliminated with pills seemed almost magical. Many POWs initially refused painkillers, suspicious of American motives or convinced they were being weakened deliberately. Tran Duc Minh watched American medics perform an emergency appendectomy on a fellow prisoner. The patient was unconscious within minutes of receiving anesthesia. The surgeon worked through a small, precise incision rather than the crude cuts Vietnamese medics were forced to make with limited tools. Within an hour, the operation was complete, and the patient was waking up comfortable and alert. The psychological impact of receiving life-saving care from enemies proved more powerful than any interrogation technique. Le Van Duc later described the moment he realized American medics had saved his life. "How could I hate people who cared more about my health than my own commanders ever had?" Dental care provided another shocking revelation. Most Vietnamese soldiers had never seen a dentist. Tooth problems were endured until teeth fell out naturally. American dental officers not only treated existing problems, but provided preventive care, teaching proper oral hygiene and providing toothbrushes and toothpaste. The camp's medical facility operated like a small hospital, complete with specialized departments. Orthopedic specialists treated bone fractures with metal pins and plates. Ophthalmologists corrected vision problems with eyeglasses. Even psychiatric care was available for prisoners struggling with trauma or depression. Blood transfusions represented perhaps the ultimate medical miracle. Pham Van Duc had lost significant blood during capture and faced certain death. American medics matched his blood type and performed a transfusion using blood donated by American soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on him. His enemy's blood now flowed through his veins, keeping him alive. Medical records were meticulously maintained for every prisoner. Charts tracked medications, procedures, and recovery progress with bureaucratic thoroughness that impressed even skeptical POWs. This wasn't casual care, but systematic, professional medicine applied regardless of nationality or political affiliation. The contrast with North Vietnamese medical capabilities was stark and undeniable. While their own forces struggled with basic first aid, Americans provided world-class medical care to captured enemies. This generosity in the face of active warfare challenged everything POWs believed about American character. Some prisoners began to question not just American brutality, but their own side's commitment to their welfare. If the enemy cared more about their health than their own commanders, what did that say about the cause they'd been fighting for? The healing process became a form of ideological conversion more powerful than any propaganda campaign. Bodies mended by American medicine carried minds increasingly open to American ideas. The mess hall doors swung open, and Nguyen Van Duke stopped dead in his tracks. The aroma hit him first: grilled meat, fresh bread, something sweet he couldn't identify. Long tables stretched across a room larger than his entire village's community center. American soldiers and Vietnamese prisoners sat side by side, eating from identical metal trays loaded with more food than Duke had seen in months. Back in North Vietnam, military rations consisted of rice, dried fish, and whatever vegetables could be foraged. A good day meant adding some pork fat to the rice. Meat was reserved for special occasions or high-ranking officers. Most fighters survived on a handful of rice and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. The American mess hall operated like nothing Duke had ever imagined. Steam tables held multiple hot dishes simultaneously. There was beef, pork, chicken, and fish, sometimes all at the same meal. Vegetables came in varieties he'd never seen: corn, green beans, carrots, prepared in ways that actually tasted good. Tran Van Min approached the serving line with deep suspicion. Surely this abundance was a trick, a way to weaken Vietnamese resolve through decadent excess. The American cook, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, spooned generous portions onto Min's tray without any apparent regard for rationing or rank. The bread alone represented a revolution in dining. Fresh white loaves appeared daily, soft and warm from ovens that ran continuously. Butter, actual butter, not the rancid fat they occasionally received in North Vietnam, was available at every meal. Many POWs had never tasted butter in their lives. Processed foods created their own category of amazement. Canned peaches swimming in sweet syrup seemed impossibly luxurious. Vienna sausages, while hardly gourmet fare by American standards, struck Vietnamese prisoners as delicacies worthy of celebration. The concept that food could be preserved for months without spoiling challenged their understanding of basic nutrition. Le Minh Dao's first encounter with ice cream became a story he would tell for decades. The cold sweetness was unlike anything in Vietnamese cuisine. He watched American soldiers casually consuming what seemed like frozen paradise, treating this miracle as routine refreshment rather than the extraordinary treat it represented to someone from his background. Soft drinks provided another cultural shock. Coca-Cola's fizzy sweetness was completely foreign to palates accustomed to water, tea, and occasional rice wine. The idea that people would drink sugary, carbonated beverages for pleasure rather than sustenance seemed almost incomprehensibly indulgent. The variety overwhelmed prisoners. Accustomed to monotonous diets, breakfast might include eggs, bacon, pancakes, and juice. Lunch offered sandwiches, soup, and fruit. Dinner featured meat, potatoes, vegetables, and dessert. This wasn't survival eating, but genuine cuisine designed for satisfaction rather than mere sustenance. Hoang Van Tuan gained 30 pounds during his first 6 months in captivity. His uniform, already loose from months of jungle fighting, became comically oversized as American nutrition restored his health. Medical officers monitored weight gain as a measure of successful prisoner care, ensuring adequate caloric intake for proper recovery. The dining experience itself represented cultural education. POWs learned to use American utensils properly, to navigate cafeteria-style serving lines, to understand meal scheduling that didn't depend on food availability or enemy action. Regular meals at predictable times created a sense of security many had never experienced. Some prisoners initially hoarded food, unable to believe such abundance would continue. They stuffed bread into pockets, saved fruit for later, and treated each meal as potentially their last. Camp administrators patiently explained that food would be available tomorrow, and the day after, and every day thereafter. The psychological impact of abundant food proved as significant as its nutritional benefits. Hunger had been a constant companion for most Vietnamese fighters. The absence of that gnawing emptiness allowed minds to focus on thoughts beyond mere survival. Well-fed prisoners became more receptive to conversation, education, and ideological discussion. American mess sergeants took pride in feeding former enemies well. This wasn't just about following Geneva Convention requirements, but about demonstrating American values through action. Every generous portion served represented a small victory in the broader struggle for hearts and minds. The contrast with their previous existence was impossible to ignore. Vietnamese soldiers who had fought desperately for scraps of food now faced the pleasant problem of choosing between multiple options at every meal. This abundance spoke louder than any propaganda about the relative prosperity of the two societies at war. Food became a bridge between enemies, a universal language that transcended political differences and created unexpected moments of shared humanity in the midst of bitter conflict. The generator's steady hum filled the night air as Pham Van Duyck stared in amazement at the American camp. Every building blazed with electric light, turning darkness into artificial day. Street lamps illuminated pathways between barracks. Floodlights swept the perimeter with mechanical precision. This single camp consumed more electricity than his entire province back home. Most North Vietnamese soldiers came from rural villages where electricity was a distant rumor. Oil lamps and candles provided the only light after sunset. The concept of flipping a switch to instantly banish darkness seemed like magic pulled from fairy tales. Le Van Minh watched an American guard casually reach for a wall switch, flooding an entire room with bright white light. The guard didn't pause, didn't marvel at this miracle. He treated it as naturally as breathing. This casual relationship with such incredible power revealed a technological gap that went far beyond military hardware. The camp's electrical infrastructure operated with industrial-scale sophistication. Thick cables snaked between buildings, carrying power from diesel generators that ran continuously. Transformers stepped voltage up and down with mathematical precision. Circuit breakers protected against overloads with automatic switching that seemed impossibly advanced to prisoners accustomed to fire and candlelight. Electric fans provided the first taste of climate control many POWs had ever experienced. The steady breeze created artificial comfort even during Vietnam's oppressive heat. Prisoners would stand transfixed, watching metal blades slice through air with mechanical regularity, creating coolness from nothing but spinning motion. Winter brought an even greater revelation: electric heaters. Coils glowed red-hot, radiating warmth that could heat entire rooms. Nguyen Thanh Son had spent countless nights shivering in jungle foxholes, never imagining that warmth could be summoned instantly with the flip of a switch. The medical facility showcased electricity's life-saving potential. X-ray machines required massive power consumption to peer inside human bodies. Heart monitors traced electrical impulses with glowing green lines. Surgical lights eliminated shadows that could mean the difference between life and death during operations. Refrigeration technology astounded prisoners who had never seen ice outside of winter streams. Electric refrigerators kept food fresh for weeks, medicines stable for months. Ice makers produced frozen water on demand, a luxury so profound that many POWs initially refused to believe it was real. The kitchen's electrical equipment operated like an industrial assembly line. Electric mixers handled dough for hundreds of loaves. Convection ovens baked bread with precise temperature control. Dishwashers cleaned plates and utensils with hot water and mechanical scrubbing that eliminated the tedious hand-washing Vietnamese soldiers knew all too well. Communication systems depended entirely on electrical power. Telephones connected the camp to military headquarters thousands of miles away. Radio transmitters broadcast across continents with clarity that made distant voices sound like they were in the next room. Public address systems carried announcements to every corner of the facility simultaneously. Tran Duc Minh discovered electric tools in the camp's workshop. Power drills bored holes with effortless precision. Electric saws cut through wood like butter. Sanders smoothed surfaces to impossible smoothness. These tools accomplished in minutes what would take hours of manual labor with traditional implements. The laundry facility demonstrated electricity's role in basic hygiene. Washing machines agitated clothes with mechanical power that cleaned far better than hand scrubbing in rivers. Electric dryers eliminated the weather dependence that made clean clothes a luxury in North Vietnam. Even entertainment required electrical power. Record players spun vinyl discs with motorized precision, reproducing music with fidelity that seemed supernatural. Movie projectors cast moving images onto screens, creating windows into American culture that no propaganda could have prepared them for. The psychological impact of constant electrical power went beyond mere convenience. It represented mastery over natural forces that Vietnamese technology couldn't approach. The Americans had harnessed lightning itself, bending it to serve human comfort and efficiency. Some POWs began to understand why American forces seemed so confident, so technologically superior. When your society could generate unlimited power, distribute it efficiently, and use it to enhance every aspect of daily life, military supremacy became almost inevitable. The steady electrical hum became the soundtrack of captivity, a constant reminder of the technological chasm between the two civilizations at war. The projector whirred to life, casting flickering images onto a white screen stretched across the recreation hall. Nguyen Van Duc had never seen a movie before. Moving pictures seemed impossible. How could people be trapped inside a machine, acting out stories for his entertainment? Yet, there they were, larger than life, speaking English in voices that filled the room. The first film was a John Wayne Western. American soldiers cheered as the cowboy hero gunned down outlaws in dusty frontier towns. Duke watched in fascination, not understanding the dialogue, but following the action with growing amazement. The horses looked real enough to touch. The gunshots made him flinch. When Wayne kissed the beautiful woman at the end, some Vietnamese prisoners laughed nervously. Such public displays of affection were unthinkable back home. Movie nights became the week's highlight for many POWs. The Americans showed everything from war films to comedies to musicals. Le Van Minh found himself transported to worlds he'd never imagined. New York City with its towering buildings, California beaches with endless sand, suburban neighborhoods where every family owned cars and televisions. The propaganda value wasn't subtle. War movies depicted American soldiers as brave heroes fighting for freedom and democracy. Films about American life showcased prosperity that seemed almost fantastical to prisoners from impoverished villages. Even entertainment carried ideological messages about the superiority of American values and lifestyle. But perhaps the most surreal experience came when POWs watched Hollywood's version of the Vietnam War itself. The Green Berets played to a room full of actual Vietnamese fighters who had been shooting at American soldiers just months earlier. They watched John Wayne portray their conflict as a noble struggle between freedom and communism, seeing themselves depicted as either helpless victims needing rescue or faceless enemies deserving destruction. Tran Van Minh later described the psychological vertigo of watching his own war transformed into entertainment. The jungle firefights he'd lived through became choreographed action sequences. The terror and confusion of battle became heroic adventure. American audiences would watch this movie for fun, while he had lived it as nightmare reality. Television represented an even greater technological marvel. The camp's TV set received broadcasts from Saigon stations, bringing news, variety shows, and American programs dubbed into Vietnamese. Prisoners gathered around the glowing screen like villagers around a campfire, mesmerized by the parade of images flowing from the mysterious box. News broadcasts provided their first glimpse of how the war was being portrayed to American audiences. They saw footage of battles they had fought, presented from the American perspective with commentary that painted them as communist aggressors threatening South Vietnamese democracy. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, seeing themselves portrayed as villains in their own struggle for national liberation. Music became another tool of cultural conversion. American soldiers shared their record collections, introducing POWs to rock and roll, country music, and pop ballads that dominated American radio. Elvis Presley's gyrating hips shocked prisoners accustomed to traditional Vietnamese folk music. The raw energy of rock music seemed to embody American youth culture in ways that formal propaganda never could. Some POWs developed genuine appreciation for American music. Hoang Van Tuan learned to play guitar from an American guard, strumming out country songs around evening campfires. Music created bonds between former enemies, a universal language that transcended political differences and cultural barriers. Radio broadcasts in Vietnamese provided more direct propaganda. American psychological operations specialists produced programs explaining American war aims, democratic values, and the benefits of cooperation. These broadcasts mixed news with entertainment, using popular music and variety show formats to make political messages more palatable. The sophistication of American mass media impressed even skeptical prisoners. Professional production values, technical quality, and entertainment value far exceeded anything produced in North Vietnam. The communists had printing presses and radio transmitters, but nothing approaching the technological sophistication of American media operations. Record players in the recreation hall allowed prisoners to request favorite songs. Many developed tastes for American popular music that they would carry home after the war. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Motown artists became familiar names to fighters who had once known only traditional Vietnamese music. The psychological impact of entertainment technology went beyond mere distraction. It demonstrated American cultural power, the ability to create compelling narratives, produce professional entertainment, and distribute it globally. This soft power proved as intimidating as military hardware, showing a society so prosperous it could afford to create beauty and pleasure purely for enjoyment. Movies, music, and television became windows into American society that revealed a civilization of unprecedented wealth, creativity, and technological sophistication. Entertainment became education, showing rather than telling prisoners about the society they had been fighting against. The rumble started before dawn, a deep, mechanical growling that seemed to shake the earth itself. Pham Duc Loy pressed his face against the barracks window and watched in amazement as a convoy of American vehicles rolled past the camp perimeter. Massive trucks, each one larger than any vehicle he'd ever seen, carried supplies with effortless power. Their diesel engines roared with a confidence that spoke of unlimited fuel and mechanical mastery. Back in North Vietnam, transportation meant bicycles, ox carts, and walking. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail relied on human porters carrying supplies on their backs through jungle paths. A single bicycle loaded with rice and ammunition was considered valuable military equipment. Here, Americans moved tons of cargo with casual efficiency that defied everything Loy understood about logistics. The camp's motor pool showcased American industrial might in ways that left POWs speechless. Jeeps sat in perfect rows, their olive-drab paint gleaming under maintenance lights. Each vehicle represented more steel, rubber, and mechanical complexity than most Vietnamese villages possessed in total. Mechanics worked beneath raised hoods, adjusting engines with precision tools that looked like surgical instruments. Nguyen Van Duc watched American soldiers perform routine maintenance on a 2.5-ton truck. They drained oil that was cleaner than any lubricant he'd seen in North Vietnam, replaced it with fresh fluid, and discarded the old oil as if it were worthless. This casual waste of valuable resources revealed a society so wealthy it could afford to throw away what his people would treasure. Helicopters provided the most dramatic demonstration of mechanical superiority. Le Van Minh had been captured when one of these mechanical birds descended from the sky, its rotor wash flattening jungle vegetation and creating hurricane-force winds. Now he watched them take off and land with routine precision, carrying supplies and personnel across distances that would take days to cover on foot. The complexity of helicopter maintenance fascinated prisoners who had never seen machinery more sophisticated than a bicycle. Mechanics checked hundreds of components, tested hydraulic systems, and calibrated instruments with meticulous care. A single helicopter required more maintenance expertise than North Vietnam possessed for its entire transportation network. Construction equipment operated around the camp like mechanical dinosaurs. Bulldozers pushed earth with blade attachments wider than Vietnamese houses. Dump trucks hauled loads that would require dozens of human carriers. Cement mixers produced concrete for permanent structures that would outlast anything built by hand in North Vietnamese villages. Tran Duc Minh observed American engineers operating a road grader, smoothing camp streets with mechanical precision. The machine's blade carved perfectly level surfaces while its operator sat in an enclosed cab, protected from weather and debris. This single piece of equipment could build better roads than entire Vietnamese construction crews working with hand tools. The fuel consumption alone staggered prisoners accustomed to rationing every drop of gasoline. American vehicles burned fuel continuously, idling engines, running generators, powering equipment that operated around the clock. The camp consumed more petroleum in a day than most North Vietnamese units saw in months of combat operations. Maintenance facilities resembled small factories, complete with hydraulic lifts, power tools, and diagnostic equipment. American mechanics could completely rebuild engines, replace transmissions, and fabricate parts with machine shop precision. Vietnamese fighters were lucky to find spare bicycle parts. Americans manufactured replacement components for complex mechanical systems. The psychological impact went beyond mere envy of superior equipment. These machines represented a civilization that had mastered the physical world through engineering and industrial production. Every vehicle demonstrated American ability to transform raw materials into sophisticated tools that multiplied human capability exponentially. Some POWs began to understand why American confidence seemed unshakable. When your society could produce unlimited mechanical power, deploy it globally, and maintain it indefinitely, military victory became a matter of logistics rather than courage. The machines themselves became weapons more powerful than rifles or artillery, symbols of industrial supremacy that made resistance seem almost futile. The steady rumble of engines became another soundtrack of captivity, a constant reminder that America possessed mechanical power beyond Vietnamese comprehension or ability to counter. The telephone rang with crisp electronic precision, its bell cutting through the humid Vietnamese air like a technological miracle. Hoang Van Tuan had never heard such a sound, clean, mechanical, utterly reliable. The American communications officer lifted the handset and began speaking to someone, thousands of miles away, as if they were standing in the same room. Back in North Vietnam, communication meant runners carrying messages through jungle paths, smoke signals when weather permitted, or radio transmissions that crackled with static and frequently failed entirely. Important orders took days to reach field commanders. Battle reports arrived long after engagements had ended. The Americans, by contrast, maintained instant contact with command structures spanning the globe. The camp's telephone system operated with Swiss precision. Multiple lines connected directly to Saigon headquarters, Pentagon offices, and supply depots across Southeast Asia. Nguyen Thanh Son watched in fascination as operators placed calls by simply dialing numbers, connecting voices across oceans with technology that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Long-distance communication revealed the true scope of American military organization. Le Van Minh overheard conversations between camp administrators and logistics officers in Hawaii. discussing supply shipments with the casual efficiency of shopkeepers ordering inventory. What would have required weeks of planning and coordination for North Vietnamese forces happened in minutes of telephone conversation. The radio room showcased even more impressive technology. Banks of transmitters and receivers filled an entire building, their dials and switches glowing with electronic indicators that pulsed like mechanical heartbeats. Operators wearing headphones maintained constant contact with aircraft, ships, and ground units across Southeast Asia, coordinating operations with real-time precision. Tran Van Min discovered that American radio networks operated on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Military communications, supply coordination, medical evacuation requests, and intelligence reports flowed through separate channels without interference. This technological sophistication allowed complex operations to unfold with mechanical coordination that left Vietnamese observers amazed. The speed of information flow challenged everything POWs understood about military organization. Battle reports reached headquarters within minutes of engagement. Supply requests generated immediate responses from logistics centers. Medical emergencies triggered evacuation helicopters that arrived with life-saving speed impossible under North Vietnamese communication limitations. Teletype machines clattered continuously, printing messages that arrived from around the world in real time. Pham Duc Loy watched paper emerge from these mechanical typewriters, carrying orders and information with printed precision that eliminated the errors and delays inherent in voice communication. The steady clicking became another sound of American technological mastery. Administrative efficiency impressed prisoners accustomed to bureaucratic chaos. American communication systems generated paper trails that tracked every decision, every supply shipment, every personnel movement with obsessive detail. This documentation created organizational memory that allowed complex operations to function smoothly despite constant personnel rotations. The psychological impact of witnessing global communication networks proved as significant as the technology itself. These systems revealed an enemy that operated not as isolated units, but as components of a vast, interconnected machine spanning continents. Every camp, every base, every ship formed part of a communication web that coordinated American power on a planetary scale. Some POWs began to understand why resistance seemed futile against such organizational capability. When your enemy could coordinate resources globally, respond to threats instantly, and maintain supply lines through electronic communication, traditional guerrilla tactics became increasingly ineffective. The communication networks themselves became weapons more powerful than guns or bombs. The constant electronic chatter, telephones ringing, radios crackling, teletype machines printing, created a soundtrack of technological superiority that reminded prisoners hourly of the vast organizational gap between the two sides. American communication networks represented not just military advantage, but civilizational supremacy that made victory seem almost inevitable through sheer technological momentum. The hot water hit Nguyen Van Duc's skin like a revelation from heaven. He had never experienced anything like it, endless streams of clean, heated water flowing from metal fixtures with the simple turn of a handle. Back in his village, bathing meant cold river water and harsh soap made from animal fat. Here, American prisoners showered daily with water heated by mechanical systems that never seemed to run dry. The shower facility itself defied everything Duc understood about hygiene and infrastructure. Rows of individual stalls provided privacy impossible in Vietnamese communal bathing areas. Each stall had its own controls for water temperature and pressure. Drain systems carried away dirty water with engineering precision that prevented the standing pools and mud that characterized washing areas back home. Soap represented another cultural revelation. American prisoners received bars of white, sweet-smelling soap that produced rich lathers and cleaned without the harsh scrubbing required by Vietnamese alternatives. Shampoo, A concept entirely foreign to most POWs transformed hair washing from a chore into something approaching luxury. The variety of cleaning products seemed almost incomprehensibly abundant. Levan Min's first encounter with a flush toilet created a moment of pure bewilderment. The porcelain fixture looked like furniture rather than a utilitarian necessity. When he pressed the handle and watched clean water swirl away waste with mechanical efficiency, he understood he was witnessing technology that represented a fundamental advance in human civilization. The concept of indoor plumbing challenged everything POWs knew about sanitation and disease prevention. Tran Duc Minh had grown up using outdoor latrines that bred flies and spread illness throughout his village. American facilities eliminated waste through underground pipe networks that carried contamination far from living areas with engineering sophistication that seemed almost magical. Hot water systems operated continuously, providing heated water for washing, cleaning, and food preparation without the laborious process of heating water over fires. Hoang Van Tuan watched American maintenance workers service water heaters, massive tanks that stored and heated hundreds of gallons using gas burners controlled by automatic thermostats that maintained perfect temperatures without human intervention. Laundry facilities showcased American hygiene standards in ways that left prisoners speechless. Washing machines agitated clothes with mechanical power that cleaned far more effectively than hand scrubbing in streams. Electric dryers eliminated weather dependence and produced clothing that emerged soft, warm, and completely dry, regardless of humidity or rain. The Americans provided each prisoner with multiple sets of clean clothing, replacing worn garments with regularity that seemed wasteful to people accustomed to wearing the same clothes until they fell apart. Fresh uniforms appeared weekly, cleaned and pressed with mechanical precision that produced creases sharper than anything achieved by hand ironing. Personal hygiene products arrived regularly: toothbrushes, toothpaste, razors, and shaving cream that transformed daily grooming from painful necessity into almost pleasant routine. Pham Van Duc had never owned a toothbrush before captivity. The concept of daily dental care, combined with regular dental examinations, represented preventive medicine completely unknown in North Vietnamese military culture. Medical personnel emphasized sanitation with religious fervor, explaining disease prevention through cleanliness with scientific precision that challenged traditional Vietnamese understanding of illness and health. They demonstrated proper hand-washing techniques, explained bacterial transmission, and enforced hygiene standards that eliminated the dysentery and parasitic infections that plagued North Vietnamese forces. The psychological impact of constant cleanliness proved as significant as its health benefits. Clean bodies, clean clothes, and clean living spaces created mental clarity and emotional well-being that many prisoners had never experienced. The absence of persistent dirt, odors, and discomfort allowed minds to focus on thoughts beyond mere physical survival. Some POWs began to understand that American military effectiveness stemmed partly from superior hygiene and health maintenance. Soldiers who stayed clean and healthy could fight more effectively than those weakened by preventable diseases and poor sanitation. Cleanliness became another weapon in America's technological arsenal. The steady flow of hot water, the mechanical efficiency of waste disposal, and the abundance of cleaning supplies created a daily reminder of the vast technological gap between the two civilizations at war. American hygiene standards represented not just comfort, but evidence of a society that had mastered the basic challenges of human health and sanitation through engineering solutions that seemed almost impossibly advanced to prisoners from a world of outdoor latrines and cold river baths. The air conditioning hummed softly as Nguyen Van Duc settled into the padded chair across from Captain Robert Harrison. The interrogation room looked nothing like the torture chambers his political officers had described. Fluorescent lights cast even illumination across clean walls decorated with maps and charts. A small table held glasses of ice water, cigarettes, and even candy, luxuries that seemed impossibly out of place in what should have been a house of horrors. Harrison spoke in careful Vietnamese, his pronunciation clumsy but understandable. He offered Duck a cigarette, American tobacco, smooth and mild compared to the harsh local varieties Vietnamese soldiers occasionally managed to acquire. The simple gesture created cognitive dissonance that left Duke struggling to maintain his mental defenses. "We know you're hungry," Harrison said, pushing a plate of sandwiches across the table. "Eat first. We can talk later." This wasn't the brutal interrogation Duke had been trained to resist. Where were the beatings, the sleep deprivation, the systematic torture designed to break his will and extract military secrets? The Americans had developed interrogation techniques that relied on comfort rather than pain, understanding that well-fed, well-rested prisoners often proved more cooperative than those weakened by brutality. Le Van Min later described his confusion during his first interrogation session. "They treated me better than my own officers ever had. How could I hate people who showed me such kindness?" The interrogation facility operated like a professional office building rather than a prison. Individual rooms were climate-controlled and furnished with comfortable seating. Recording equipment captured conversations with technical precision, but the machinery remained largely hidden to avoid intimidating prisoners. The atmosphere felt more like a business meeting than a military interrogation. American intelligence officers had studied Vietnamese culture extensively, tailoring their approaches to individual prisoners based on detailed psychological profiles. Tran Duc Minh, identified as a rural farmer-turned-soldier, received treatment designed to appeal to his agricultural background. His interrogator discussed farming techniques, showed interest in Vietnamese rice cultivation, and gradually steered conversations toward military topics with subtle skill. The soft approach proved devastatingly effective. Hoang Van Tuan found himself looking forward to interrogation sessions that provided relief from the boredom of camp routine. His interrogator, Major David Chen, had studied Vietnamese history and could discuss ancient dynasties with scholarly knowledge that impressed even skeptical prisoners. These intellectual conversations gradually built trust that formal interrogation could never have achieved. Recording technology captured every word with clarity that amazed prisoners accustomed to communication difficulties in their own military. Hidden microphones eliminated the need for note-taking that might have disrupted the conversational flow. Tape recorders preserved exact statements for later analysis, creating permanent records of intelligence that could be cross-referenced and verified with scientific precision. The psychological warfare aspect went far beyond simple intelligence gathering. American interrogators understood that comfortable treatment would be discussed among prisoners, spreading stories of humane care that contradicted North Vietnamese propaganda about American brutality. Each positive interrogation experience became a small victory in the broader battle for hearts and minds. Some prisoners began volunteering information without formal questioning. Pham Van Duc started describing his unit's organization during casual conversations, not realizing he was providing valuable intelligence through friendly chat rather than formal interrogation. The comfortable environment lowered psychological barriers that harsh treatment would have reinforced. The contrast with North Vietnamese interrogation methods was stark and deliberate. American intelligence officers knew their prisoners had witnessed or experienced brutal questioning techniques used by their own forces. The gentle American approach created powerful psychological impact by demonstrating moral superiority through action rather than propaganda. Refreshments during sessions included foods many prisoners had never tasted: chocolate bars, soft drinks, fresh fruit imported from distant countries. These small luxuries carried symbolic weight far beyond their material value, representing a society so prosperous it could afford to share delicacies with captured enemies. The most psychologically damaging aspect wasn't the comfort itself, but the realization that Americans possess such detailed knowledge about Vietnamese military organization, troop movements, and strategic planning. The quality of their questions revealed intelligence-gathering capabilities that made resistance seem almost pointless. Some interrogation sessions lasted hours, with prisoners actually reluctant to return to general camp population. The air-conditioned rooms, comfortable furniture, and respectful treatment created oases of civilized interaction that contrasted sharply with the harsh realities of jungle warfare these soldiers had recently escaped. The interrogation process became another form of conversion, demonstrating American values through direct experience rather than propaganda lectures. Comfort became the most effective weapon of all. The classroom looked like something from an American high school. Rows of wooden desks faced a blackboard where Sergeant Michael Thompson wrote English phrases in careful block letters. Fluorescent lights illuminated textbooks, notebooks, and pencils, supplies that most Vietnamese prisoners had never seen in such abundance. This wasn't the crude propaganda sessions they'd expected, but formal education delivered with the same professionalism Americans applied to training their own soldiers. Nguyen Van Duc struggled with his first English lesson, trying to wrap his tongue around unfamiliar sounds. "Hello, my name is Duke," he repeated, following Thompson's patient pronunciation guide. The concept of voluntary education seemed almost incomprehensible. Why would captors want their prisoners to learn the enemy's language unless they planned to keep them forever? The curriculum went far beyond basic language instruction. American educators had developed comprehensive programs designed to reshape Vietnamese worldviews through systematic exposure to Western ideas. History classes presented American perspectives on democracy, capitalism, and individual freedom with academic rigor that impressed even skeptical students. Le Van Minh found himself fascinated by lessons about American government structure. The concept of elected leadership, separation of powers, and constitutional rights challenged everything he'd been taught about political organization. His instructor, a former college professor turned military educator, explained these concepts with scholarly precision that made complex ideas accessible to farmers and laborers who had never received formal education. Vocational training programs offered practical skills that could transform prisoners' post-war prospects. Tran Duc Minh learned basic automotive repair, working on American vehicles under expert supervision. The mechanical knowledge he gained represented more technical education than most Vietnamese received in civilian life. These weren't just propaganda exercises, but genuine skill-building programs that could provide economic opportunities after repatriation. The library became a revelation for prisoners who had grown up in villages without books. Shelves lined with volumes on science, literature, and philosophy offered intellectual resources beyond anything available in North Vietnam. American librarians helped prisoners navigate this treasure trove of knowledge, recommending books that would broaden their understanding of the world beyond their previous experience. Hoang Van Tuan discovered American literature through simplified versions of classic novels. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer introduced him to concepts of childhood freedom and individual adventure that contrasted sharply with the collective discipline emphasized in Vietnamese culture. These stories carried ideological messages more powerful than direct propaganda, showing rather than telling about American values. Mathematics and science classes revealed the educational foundations that made American technological superiority possible. Pham Van Duc learned basic engineering principles that explained how Americans could build such impressive machines and infrastructure. Understanding the scientific method gave him new ways of thinking about problems that went far beyond military applications. The teaching materials themselves impressed students accustomed to learning through rote memorization from worn textbooks. American educators used visual aids, practical demonstrations, and interactive exercises that made learning engaging rather than tedious. Overhead projectors displayed complex diagrams with clarity that made difficult concepts understandable. Some prisoners showed remarkable aptitude for academic work, surprising both themselves and their instructors. Nguyen Thanh Son, a rice farmer before the war, demonstrated mathematical abilities that earned him advanced placement in engineering courses. These success stories became powerful propaganda tools, showing that Vietnamese peasants could achieve intellectual heights when given proper educational opportunities. The systematic nature of American education impressed prisoners who had received only basic literacy training in North Vietnamese schools. Structured curricula, standardized testing, and progress tracking created learning environments that produced measurable results. Students could see their own improvement through objective measures that built confidence and motivation. Language exchange programs created unexpected friendships between prisoners and American soldiers. Vietnamese students taught their guards basic phrases while learning English in return. These personal relationships humanized both sides, creating bonds that transcended political differences and military roles. The most psychologically powerful aspect wasn't the education itself, but the investment Americans made in their prisoners' intellectual development. Why would enemies spend such resources on captive soldiers unless they genuinely believed in human potential for growth and change? This generosity challenged fundamental assumptions about American character that had sustained Vietnamese resistance. Some prisoners began to question not just American brutality, but their own society's commitment to human development. If enemies provided better education than their own government had ever offered, what did that say about the political system they had been fighting to defend? The classroom became another battlefield where ideas competed more effectively than bullets, transforming minds through knowledge rather than force. The crack of the baseball bat echoed across the camp's makeshift diamond as Nguyen Van Duc connected with his first pitch. The ball sailed over the infield, bouncing toward the fence while American soldiers cheered from the sidelines. 6 months ago, Duke had been shooting at these same men in jungle firefights. Now, they were teaching him America's national pastime with the patience of Little League coaches. The concept of organized recreation baffled prisoners accustomed to military life, where every moment served tactical purpose. Le Van Minh watched American soldiers spend entire afternoons playing games that had no apparent military value. Basketball courts, volleyball nets, and baseball diamonds occupied valuable space that could have housed more troops or stored additional supplies. Yet Americans treated these recreational facilities as essential infrastructure rather than frivolous luxuries. Physical education became another form of cultural indoctrination. Tran Duc Minh learned that Americans viewed sports as character-building activities that taught teamwork, fair play, and competitive spirit. These weren't just games, but systematic training in democratic values disguised as entertainment. Every rule explained, every fair play decision reinforced concepts of justice and equality under law. The equipment itself represented technological sophistication that impressed prisoners from a society where sports meant kicking makeshift balls or wrestling without formal rules. American sporting goods, leather baseballs, regulation basketballs, professional quality nets and goals demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that could produce precision recreational equipment alongside military hardware. Hoang Van Tuan discovered weightlifting in the camp's gymnasium, a building dedicated entirely to physical fitness and recreational activities. Barbells, dumbbells, and exercise machines represented American commitment to individual health and strength that went far beyond military necessity. The concept that soldiers would maintain fitness for personal satisfaction rather than just combat readiness revealed cultural values that prioritized individual well-being. Swimming pools provided perhaps the most shocking recreational luxury. Pham Van Duc had learned to swim in muddy rivers and rice paddies. Here, Chlorinated water maintained chemical purity that eliminated disease while providing recreational opportunities impossible in natural water sources. The mechanical systems that filtered, heated, and sanitized thousands of gallons represented engineering applied to pure enjoyment. Competitive leagues organized prisoners into teams that played against American units, creating sporting rivalries that replaced military hostilities. Nguyen Thanh Son found himself strategizing basketball plays with the same intensity he'd once applied to combat tactics. These games created bonds between former enemies that transcended political differences through shared competitive experiences. The American emphasis on individual achievement within team frameworks challenged Vietnamese cultural assumptions about collective versus personal success. Scoring statistics, individual records, and personal improvement goals introduced concepts of measured individual progress that differed sharply from communist emphasis on group achievement and collective identity. Exercise programs included activities many prisoners had never imagined: organized calisthenics, jogging for cardiovascular health, and strength training designed to improve physical capabilities rather than just maintain military readiness. American fitness concepts treated the human body as a machine requiring systematic maintenance and improvement. Recreational activities extended beyond traditional sports to include ping pong, billiards, and card games that filled leisure hours with structured entertainment. The concept of leisure itself, time dedicated to enjoyment rather than survival or productivity, represented cultural luxury that few Vietnamese had ever experienced. Some prisoners discovered natural athletic abilities that earned recognition and respect from American soldiers. Success in sports created positive relationships that influenced broader attitudes toward American culture and values. Athletic achievement became another bridge between enemies, creating mutual respect through shared competitive experiences. The psychological impact went beyond physical fitness or entertainment value. Recreational programs demonstrated American belief that even prisoners deserved opportunities for personal enjoyment and individual development. This generosity toward captive enemies revealed cultural values that prioritized human dignity even in wartime circumstances, challenging everything prisoners had been taught about American character and creating lasting impressions that would influence their post-war perspectives on American society and values. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the same mail truck that delivered correspondence to American soldiers. Nguyen Van Duc stared at the envelope bearing his name, written in his wife's careful handwriting. He had been captured 8 months ago, expecting never to communicate with his family again. Yet here was proof that even prisoners of war maintained connections to the world beyond barbed wire. The American postal system operated with mechanical precision that amazed prisoners accustomed to communication failures and lost messages. Le Van Minh watched mail clerks sort hundreds of letters with assembly line efficiency, routing correspondence between prisoners and their families through networks that spanned continents. The reliability impressed soldiers who had seen important military dispatches disappear into bureaucratic chaos back home. Censorship procedures revealed both American thoroughness and unexpected consideration for prisoner welfare. Tran Duc Minh's letters underwent careful review by intelligence officers who redacted military information while preserving personal content. The Americans could have simply blocked all communication, but they understood that family connections served psychological purposes that ultimately benefited camp management and prisoner cooperation. The emotional impact of receiving mail proved more powerful than any interrogation technique. Hoang Van Tuan broke down crying when he read his daughter's first letter, written in the simple characters she had learned in village school. She described planting rice, caring for their water buffalo, and waiting for his return with childlike faith that tore at his heart more effectively than any torture could have managed. American mail facilitation carried obvious propaganda value. Pham Van Duc's letters home described the medical care he received, the abundant food, and the humane treatment that contradicted everything his family had been told about American prison camps. These testimonials, filtered through Vietnamese family networks, spread stories of American generosity that undermined communist propaganda about enemy brutality. The speed of mail delivery demonstrated American organizational capabilities that extended far beyond military operations. Letters reached North Vietnamese villages faster than official communist communications, showcasing logistical networks that could deliver personal correspondence across war zones with reliability that government systems couldn't match. Some prisoners learned about major events in North Vietnam through family letters rather than official announcements. Nguyen Thanh Son discovered his village had been bombed through his brother's carefully worded description of changes in their neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on him. American captors allowed him to receive news that his own government might have censored or delayed. The writing materials provided to prisoners represented another small luxury that carried symbolic weight. Clean paper, reliable pens, and envelopes arrived regularly, ensuring that communication limitations came from censorship rather than supply shortages. This abundance contrasted sharply with the resource scarcity that characterized North Vietnamese military operations. Letter writing became a scheduled activity that provided structure and purpose to camp routine. Designated times for correspondence gave prisoners something to anticipate, a connection to life beyond captivity that maintained psychological health and prevented the despair that could lead to disciplinary problems or suicide attempts. The psychological warfare aspect extended beyond individual prisoner morale. American intelligence officers analyzed incoming mail for information about conditions in North Vietnam, troop movements, and civilian attitudes toward the war. Family letters became intelligence sources that provided insights into enemy society that formal espionage couldn't access. Some prisoners received photographs from home, images of children who had grown during their absence, family gatherings they had missed, village scenes that reminded them of the life awaiting their return. These visual connections proved even more emotionally powerful than written words, creating homesickness that made prisoners more cooperative and less likely to attempt escape. The mail system created a strange intimacy between enemies and families. American censors read private thoughts, personal fears, and family secrets while ensuring that communication served both humanitarian and intelligence purposes. This intrusion was conducted with professional discretion that respected prisoner dignity while extracting valuable information. The steady flow of letters became another reminder of American organizational superiority, the ability to maintain communication networks that functioned reliably even in wartime conditions, connecting enemies to their families while serving strategic objectives through systematic exploitation of human emotional needs. The work whistle blew at precisely 7 a.m, its mechanical precision marking the beginning of another day in the camp's labor program. Nguyen Van Duke grabbed his assigned hard hat and safety goggles, equipment he'd never seen before captivity, and joined the line of prisoners heading to the construction site. 6 months ago, he'd been a rice farmer who worked from sunrise to sunset without breaks, holidays, or any concept of labor organization. Now, he was learning American work practices that would revolutionize his understanding of human productivity. The construction foreman, Sergeant Bill Murphy, explained the day's tasks with methodical clarity. Safety procedures came first. Hard hats mandatory, safety lines required when working at height, specific protocols for operating power tools. Levan Min had spent years in dangerous jungle combat without such systematic concern for worker welfare. Here, Americans treated prisoner safety with the same seriousness they applied to their own soldiers. Work schedules followed rigid time structures that amazed prisoners accustomed to agricultural rhythms dictated by weather and seasons. 8-hour shifts with scheduled breaks every 2 hours, 30-minute lunch periods, and complete work cessation on Sundays created labor patterns that prioritized human endurance over maximum productivity. Tran Duc Minh discovered that Americans believed well-rested workers produced better results than exhausted laborers driven to collapse. The tool distribution system operated like a precision military operation. Each worker received specific equipment suited to their assigned tasks, with serial numbers tracked and maintenance schedules that ensured optimal performance. Hoang Van Tuan learned to operate power drills, circular saws, and pneumatic tools that accomplished in minutes what would take hours with traditional hand implements. Payment systems introduced concepts that challenged everything prisoners understood about labor relationships. Americans paid prisoners for their work, not much by American standards, but actual currency that could be spent in the camp store for personal items, snacks, and luxury goods. Van Duc had never received wages for labor before. Vietnamese peasants worked their own fields or provided labor service to landlords without monetary compensation. The camp store showcased American consumer culture in miniature. Shelves stocked with candy bars, cigarettes, soap, and personal items created a marketplace where prisoners could exercise choice about purchases. This introduction to consumer economics taught lessons about individual preference, market selection, and personal financial management that went far beyond simple commerce. Work quality standards emphasized precision and craftsmanship that impressed prisoners accustomed to makeshift construction using whatever materials could be found. American supervisors taught proper techniques for mixing concrete, measuring lumber, and installing electrical systems with engineering precision that created permanent structures rather than temporary shelters. Nguyen Thanh Son discovered carpentry skills that transformed his understanding of construction possibilities. American woodworking tools, levels, squares, and measuring devices enabled precision impossible with traditional Vietnamese methods. He learned to read blueprints, calculate angles, and create joints that would last decades rather than seasons. The concept of workplace hierarchy based on skill rather than political loyalty represented another cultural revelation. Prisoners who demonstrated competence earned promotion to supervisory roles regardless of their military rank or political background. Merit-based advancement challenged communist assumptions about class struggle and collective equality. Safety training included first aid instruction that taught prisoners to treat workplace injuries with medical techniques unavailable in Vietnamese villages. Bandaging wounds, treating burns, and recognizing signs of heat exhaustion became standard knowledge that would prove valuable long after repatriation. Some prisoners discovered natural aptitudes for mechanical work that surprised both themselves and their supervisors. Le Van Minh showed exceptional ability with electrical systems, learning to wire buildings with professional competence that earned respect from American electricians. These success stories demonstrated human potential that transcended political and cultural boundaries. The psychological impact extended beyond skill acquisition to fundamental changes in work attitudes. American labor practices emphasized individual responsibility, quality control, and personal pride in craftsmanship that contrasted sharply with collective work assignments common in communist systems. Prisoners learned to take ownership of their tasks rather than simply following orders. Work programs created unexpected bonds between prisoners and American supervisors who shared technical knowledge with generous patience. Professional relationships developed that transcended military roles, creating mutual respect based on shared commitment to quality workmanship rather than political ideology. The steady rhythm of productive labor, combined with fair compensation and skill development, created daily purpose that maintained psychological health while teaching valuable lessons about American work culture that would influence prisoners' post-war perspectives on labor, productivity, and individual achievement in ways that formal propaganda never could have accomplished. The wooden cross stood at the entrance to the makeshift chapel, its simple design carved by an American chaplain who had served in 3 previous conflicts. Nguyen Van Duc stared at the Christian symbol with confusion and wonder. In North Vietnam, religious practice had been systematically suppressed by communist authorities who viewed faith as counter-revolutionary superstition. Here, American captors not only permitted worship, but actively facilitated it with resources and respect that seemed impossible to reconcile with everything he'd been taught about godless capitalist oppression. The chapel itself occupied a converted storage building, its interior transformed with donated materials and volunteer labor from both American soldiers and Vietnamese prisoners. Wooden pews faced a simple altar decorated with flowers that American personnel gathered from the surrounding countryside. Colored glass windows, crafted by artistic prisoners under chaplain supervision, cast rainbow patterns across walls that had once stored military supplies. Le Van Minh had been raised Buddhist before communist education convinced him that religion was primitive thinking, incompatible with scientific socialism. Now, he found himself sitting in meditation sessions led by Chaplain Robert Chen, a Chinese-American officer who spoke fluent Vietnamese and understood Buddhist philosophy with scholarly precision. The irony wasn't lost on him. An American military officer teaching him about his own ancestral faith with deeper knowledge than most Vietnamese possessed. The Buddhist temple occupied another converted building, complete with traditional altar arrangements and incense burners that filled the space with familiar fragrances from home. American supply officers had somehow acquired proper Buddhist ceremonial items, bronze bowls, prayer wheels, and meditation cushions that created authentic worship environments impossible to maintain during active combat operations. Tran Duc Minh discovered that American religious tolerance extended beyond mere permission to active encouragement. Chaplains of various faiths served the camp community, providing spiritual counseling to prisoners who struggled with the psychological challenges of captivity, separation from family, and cognitive dissonance created by humane treatment from supposed enemies. Catholic prisoners found themselves particularly amazed by American religious accommodation. Hoang Van Tuan had hidden his Catholic faith from communist authorities who viewed Christianity as foreign contamination of Vietnamese culture. Here, American Catholic chaplains celebrated Mass in Vietnamese, using translations that preserved liturgical meaning while making worship accessible to prisoners who had been forced to practice their faith in secret for years. The psychological impact of religious freedom proved more profound than many prisoners had anticipated. Pham Van Duc found himself questioning not just communist propaganda about American brutality, but fundamental assumptions about the relationship between political systems and spiritual life. If Americans could respect Vietnamese religious traditions while communists suppressed them, what did that reveal about the true nature of the competing ideologies? Interfaith dialogue sessions brought together Buddhist, Catholic, and Protestant prisoners in discussions that would have been impossible in North Vietnam's religiously restrictive environment. American chaplains facilitated these conversations with theological sophistication that impressed even skeptical participants. The intellectual freedom to explore spiritual questions created mental liberation that complemented physical captivity in ways that challenged everything prisoners understood about freedom and oppression. Some prisoners experienced genuine spiritual awakening during captivity, finding comfort in religious practices that provided psychological anchors during the uncertainty of imprisonment. Nguyen Thanh Son began attending both Buddhist meditation sessions and Christian services, exploring spiritual traditions with curiosity that had been suppressed by communist education but flourished under American religious tolerance. The camp's religious calendar accommodated multiple faith traditions with scheduling precision that ensured all prisoners could observe their holy days without conflict. Christmas celebrations included Vietnamese Catholics alongside American Christians, while Buddhist festivals received equal recognition and resources that demonstrated genuine respect for religious diversity rather than mere tolerance. The steady rhythm of religious observance, daily prayers, weekly services, seasonal celebrations, provided spiritual structure that maintained psychological health while demonstrating American commitment to human dignity that extended beyond political differences to fundamental questions of meaning, purpose, and transcendent hope that sustained prisoners through the challenges of captivity and uncertainty about their eventual fate. The document arrived in a manila envelope bearing official seals and multiple signatures. Nguyen Van Duc had never seen anything like it. A thick booklet printed in Vietnamese that outlined his rights as a prisoner of war under something called the Geneva Convention. The American officer who handed it to him, Captain James Morrison, explained that these weren't American rules, but international laws that governed how civilized nations treated captured enemies. The concept seemed almost incomprehensible to a soldier from a country where legal protections for anyone, let alone enemies, barely existed. Le Van Minh studied the translated text with growing amazement. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners adequate food, medical care, shelter, and protection from violence or intimidation. It prohibited torture, required humane treatment, and established procedures for prisoner complaints and international inspection. These weren't generous American policies, but legal obligations that bound all signatory nations to specific standards of conduct during wartime. The Red Cross inspection team arrived on a Thursday morning, their white vehicles marked with red crosses that symbolized neutral humanitarian concern. Tran Duc Minh watched Swiss and Swedish officials conduct systematic interviews with prisoners, checking living conditions, reviewing medical records, and documenting treatment according to international standards that transcended national politics or military objectives. The inspection process itself demonstrated American commitment to legal compliance that impressed prisoners accustomed to military systems where rules existed primarily as propaganda rather than operational constraints. Hoang Van Tuan observed Red Cross officials measuring cell dimensions, testing food quality, and interviewing prisoners without American supervision. Oversight that revealed genuine accountability to international law rather than mere public relations gestures. Documentation systems tracked every aspect of prisoner treatment with bureaucratic precision that ensured compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. Pham Van Duc's medical records, disciplinary reports, and work assignments were meticulously recorded in files that could be reviewed by international inspectors at any time. This transparency contrasted sharply with North Vietnamese military practices where record-keeping served political rather than legal purposes. The complaint procedure established formal channels for prisoners to report mistreatment or request assistance without fear of retaliation. Nguyen Thanh Son filed a grievance about work assignment schedules, following procedures outlined in the Geneva Convention Handbook. American officials investigated his complaint with legal seriousness that treated enemy prisoners' concerns as legitimate rather than automatically dismissible. Legal protections extended beyond basic survival needs to encompass dignity and respect that challenged everything prisoners understood about warfare and enemy treatment. The Geneva Convention prohibited public humiliation, required respect for personal property, and established communication rights that treated captured soldiers as human beings rather than military assets to be exploited without constraint. Some prisoners began to understand that American adherence to international law represented strategic advantage rather than mere humanitarian gesture. Nations that followed Geneva Convention standards maintained moral authority that strengthened diplomatic positions and encouraged enemy surrender by guaranteeing humane treatment rather than torture or execution. The psychological impact of legal protection proved as significant as physical care. Knowing that international law guaranteed their rights created a sense of security that reduced desperation and prevented the resistance or escape attempts that might have resulted from fear of abuse. Legal framework became another tool of effective prisoner management through systematic respect for human dignity. American officers received regular training on Geneva Convention requirements, with legal advisors ensuring that camp operations complied with international standards regardless of military convenience or political pressure. This institutional commitment to legal compliance demonstrated civilizational maturity that impressed prisoners from a society where law served political power rather than constraining it. The steady presence of international oversight, Red Cross inspections, legal documentation, complaint procedures, created accountability systems that protected prisoners while demonstrating American confidence in their treatment methods. Legal compliance became another weapon more powerful than brutality, showing the world that America fought according to civilized rules while maintaining moral superiority that strengthened rather than weakened military effectiveness through systematic respect for international law and human dignity, even during wartime. The cooking lesson began with Sergeant Mike O'Brien, struggling to pronounce pho correctly, while Nguyen Van Duc demonstrated the proper way to balance fish sauce, lime juice, and chili peppers. What had started as a simple request for authentic Vietnamese soup had evolved into an unlikely cultural exchange program that transformed both prisoners and guards in ways neither side had anticipated. Le Van Minh found himself teaching American soldiers the intricate art of Vietnamese calligraphy, his brushstrokes forming elegant characters that spelled out English words in traditional Vietnamese script. The soldiers watched with fascination as he explained how each stroke carried meaning beyond mere communication, how the curve of a line could express emotion, how the spacing between characters created rhythm and flow that made writing itself a form of meditation. The Americans reciprocated with enthusiasm that surprised prisoners accustomed to cultural superiority attitudes from their own officers. Tran Duc Minh learned to play guitar from Corporal Danny Martinez, who patiently taught him American folk songs while learning Vietnamese melodies in return. Their evening jam sessions attracted audiences from both sides, creating musical bridges that transcended the language barriers and political divisions that officially separated them. Language exchange programs flourished with organic enthusiasm that formal education couldn't match. Hoang Van Tuan discovered that teaching Vietnamese pronunciation to Americans required him to analyze his own language in ways he'd never considered. Explaining tonal differences, grammatical structures, and cultural context gave him new appreciation for the complexity of his native tongue, while building friendships with soldiers who struggled to master sounds their mouths weren't trained to produce. American soldiers shared their own cultural treasures with generous curiosity. Pham Van Duc learned to play poker, discovering the psychological strategies and mathematical probabilities that made the game more than simple gambling. The Americans taught him to read facial expressions, calculate odds, and manage risk, skills that applied far beyond card games to life decisions and strategic thinking. Holiday celebrations became fusion events that blended traditions in ways that would have been impossible outside the unique environment of captivity. Nguyen Thanh Son helped American soldiers understand the significance of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, while participating in 4th of July barbecues that introduced him to American concepts of patriotic celebration and community gathering. The cultural exchange extended to practical skills that proved mutually beneficial. Vietnamese prisoners taught Americans jungle survival techniques, plant identification, and navigation methods that could save lives in Southeast Asian environments. Americans shared mechanical knowledge, electrical skills, and organizational methods that could improve efficiency and safety in any environment. Some exchanges revealed unexpected similarities between cultures that propaganda had portrayed as fundamentally incompatible. Both Vietnamese and American soldiers valued family loyalty, personal honor, and protection of the innocent. These shared values created common ground that made friendship possible despite the political circumstances that had made them enemies. The psychological impact of cultural exchange proved more profound than anyone had anticipated. Seeing Americans as individual human beings with families, dreams, and fears, rather than faceless enemies, challenged fundamental assumptions that had sustained Vietnamese resistance. Similarly, American soldiers discovered that their captives possessed intelligence, creativity, and dignity that contradicted dehumanizing propaganda about Asian enemies. Long-term friendships formed through shared experiences that created bonds stronger than political ideology or military duty. Le Van Min and his American language partner, Sergeant Tom Wilson, developed mutual respect that survived the war and continued through decades of correspondence after repatriation. These personal relationships became living proof that human connection could transcend political differences. The camp's informal cultural center became a neutral space where enemies could meet as human beings rather than soldiers. Art exhibitions displayed Vietnamese paintings alongside American photographs. Poetry readings featured works in both languages with translations that captured meaning across cultural boundaries. These artistic expressions revealed shared humanity that made continued hostility increasingly difficult to maintain. Some prisoners began to question not just American brutality, but the fundamental assumptions about cultural superiority that had justified their participation in the conflict. If Americans could appreciate Vietnamese art, learn Vietnamese customs, and respect Vietnamese traditions, what did that say about communist claims of Western cultural imperialism and racial hatred? The steady rhythm of cultural exchange, cooking lessons, language practice, artistic collaboration created daily opportunities for human connection that gradually transformed attitudes on both sides, building bridges of understanding that would influence post-war relationships and challenge the political narratives that had made enemies of people who discovered they could be friends. The injection site throbbed with unusual intensity as Nguyen Van Duc rolled down his sleeve, wondering why this particular vaccination required such extensive paperwork and multiple consent forms. He couldn't fully understand. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had explained it was an experimental hepatitis vaccine that could protect him from diseases common in tropical climates. What she hadn't mentioned was that the serum contained experimental compounds being tested for their effects on memory formation and psychological resistance. The medical research facility occupied an entire wing of the camp's hospital, its laboratories equipped with centrifuges, microscopes, and analysis equipment that rivaled university research centers. Le Van Min had volunteered for what he believed were routine medical studies, attracted by extra privileges and the promise of contributing to medical knowledge that could help other prisoners. He didn't realize he was participating in classified programs designed to test interrogation enhancement drugs and behavioral modification techniques. Dr. James Morrison's research focused on stress responses and psychological breaking points, using prisoners as test subjects in experiments that would have violated medical ethics in civilian settings. Tran Duc Minh underwent a series of psychological evaluations that he thought were standard mental health assessments. In reality, researchers were testing his responses to various stimuli, measuring how different drugs affected his willingness to cooperate and his ability to resist questioning. The sleep studies seemed benign enough. Prisoners volunteered to spend nights in comfortable beds, while researchers monitored their brainwaves and sleep patterns. Hoang Van Tuan appreciated the soft mattresses and climate-controlled rooms that provided better rest than standard barracks. He didn't know that researchers were testing sleep deprivation techniques, measuring how different amounts of rest affected cognitive function and psychological resistance. Some experiments exploited prisoners' medical needs for research purposes that served military rather than humanitarian objectives. Pham Van Duc's infected wound became a testing ground for experimental antibiotics that researchers wanted to evaluate under field conditions. While the treatment ultimately healed his injury, the primary purpose was gathering data about drug effectiveness rather than patient care. The psychological research proved particularly insidious because it disguised itself as therapeutic counseling. Nguyen Thanh Son participated in what he believed were helpful therapy sessions designed to address trauma and homesickness. The American psychologist, Dr. Robert Chen, did provide genuine emotional support, but he was also testing techniques for breaking down psychological defenses and encouraging cooperation through calculated empathy and manufactured trust. Nutritional experiments used the camp's abundant food supply as a cover for testing how different diets affected prisoner behavior and health. Some prisoners received supplements that contained experimental compounds designed to influence mood and cognitive function. The improved physical condition that resulted from these studies masked their true purpose as research into chemical methods of behavioral control. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the experiments themselves, but how they were integrated into genuinely beneficial medical care that prisoners desperately needed. Real treatments for malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds were combined with experimental procedures that served research objectives rather than patient welfare. This mixing of legitimate medicine with unethical experimentation made it nearly impossible for prisoners to give truly informed consent. Medical records from these programs were classified for decades, preventing the full scope of research from becoming public knowledge. Some prisoners experienced long-term health effects that they never connected to their medical treatment during captivity. Others suffered psychological consequences from experimental drugs that altered their brain chemistry in ways that persisted long after repatriation. The violation of medical ethics was systematic rather than accidental, with research protocols approved by military authorities who prioritized intelligence gathering over patient welfare. The Nuremberg Code's requirements for voluntary consent and patient benefit were ignored in favor of military necessity and scientific curiosity about human psychological and physiological limits. The irony was profound. Prisoners received the best medical care of their lives, while simultaneously being exploited as unwitting test subjects in experiments that violated fundamental principles of medical ethics. The advanced care that impressed them so deeply came with hidden costs that they wouldn't understand until years later, when the true nature of their treatment became clear through declassified documents and whistleblower revelations that exposed the dark side of American medical generosity. The wirecutters felt cold against Nguyen Van Duke's palm as he crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the fence that separated him from the jungle beyond. 3 months of careful observation had revealed what he believed was a weakness in the American security perimeter, a section where vegetation grew close enough to the fence to provide cover during the vulnerable moments of cutting through the chain link. What he didn't realize was that motion sensors had been tracking his reconnaissance for weeks. Le Van Minh had spent 2 months planning his escape route, memorizing guard rotations and identifying blind spots in the watchtower coverage. His plan seemed foolproof. Wait for the shift change at 300 hours, crawl through the drainage culvert that carried rainwater under the fence, then disappear into the familiar terrain of Vietnamese countryside. He made it exactly 47 meters beyond the perimeter before infrared cameras guided pursuit teams directly to his location. The sophisticated security systems impressed even prisoners who had expected American technological advantages. Tran Duc Minh discovered that the seemingly simple fence line contained multiple layers of detection: pressure sensors buried beneath the ground, motion detectors hidden in vegetation, and thermal imaging cameras that could spot human heat signatures through jungle canopy. The Americans had created security networks that made escape virtually impossible without inside knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities. Ground-penetrating radar detected tunnel attempts before prisoners could dig more than a few feet. Hoang Van Tuan's carefully planned underground route triggered alarms that brought guards to his location within minutes of breaking ground. The Americans explained that seismic sensors could detect digging vibrations from hundreds of meters away, making tunnel escapes as futile as direct fence cutting. The psychological impact of failed escape attempts proved as devastating as the physical recapture. Pham Van Duke realized that American security technology made traditional escape methods obsolete. The jungle skills that had kept him alive during combat operations were useless against electronic surveillance systems that could track movement through dense vegetation with precision that exceeded human senses. Punishment for escape attempts revealed another aspect of American psychological warfare. Rather than brutal beatings or extended isolation, recaptured prisoners faced systematic analysis of their escape methods, detailed debriefing about their motivations, and educational sessions about the futility of further attempts. This clinical approach proved more demoralizing than physical punishment because it demonstrated American confidence in their security systems. Some prisoners began to understand that the Americans wanted them to attempt escape, using failed attempts as opportunities to test and improve security measures while gathering intelligence about prisoner psychology and planning capabilities. Nguyen Thanh Son realized his escape attempt had provided Americans with valuable data about Vietnamese military training, survival skills, and psychological breaking points. The camp's security briefings became another form of psychological conditioning. American officers openly discussed their surveillance capabilities, explaining how various detection systems worked and why escape attempts were doomed to failure. This transparency served dual purposes: discouraging escape attempts while demonstrating technological superiority that reinforced American dominance. The few prisoners who managed to evade immediate capture discovered that escape from the camp was only the beginning of their problems. The surrounding area was populated by American allies who were paid bounties for returning escaped prisoners. Local villagers, motivated by American currency and threatened by communist reprisals, became an extended security network that made long-term evasion nearly impossible. The steady rhythm of failed escape attempts, careful planning, brief hope, swift recapture, created psychological conditioning that gradually convinced prisoners that freedom lay not in escape, but in cooperation with their captors. The sophisticated security systems became another demonstration of American technological superiority that made resistance seem increasingly pointless, while reinforcing the message that survival and eventual repatriation depended on acceptance rather than futile attempts to flee from captivity that was both more comfortable and more secure than anything they had experienced in their previous military service. The classroom had been transformed for the final phase of prisoner conditioning. Maps of North Vietnam covered the walls, marked with zones of American influence, communist strongholds, and areas where returning prisoners might face interrogation or suspicion. Nguyen Van Duc sat with 40 other prisoners scheduled for repatriation, listening to Captain Morrison explain the psychological challenges they would face upon return to a society that might view them as contaminated by American influence. The preparation program addressed practical concerns that revealed American understanding of Vietnamese political realities. Le Van Minh learned how to explain his weight gain, improved health, and knowledge of American customs without appearing to have been converted by enemy propaganda. The Americans provided scripts for common questions, teaching prisoners how to describe their captivity in ways that emphasized resistance rather than cooperation. Psychological conditioning sessions prepared prisoners for the cognitive dissonance they would experience when returning to North Vietnamese society. Tran Duc Minh struggled with instructions to forget the abundance he had witnessed, the medical care he had received, and the friendships he had formed with American soldiers. The Americans understood that prisoners who spoke too favorably about their treatment might face accusations of collaboration or treason. The debriefing process extracted final intelligence while providing prisoners with cover stories that could protect them from communist suspicion. Hoang Van Tuan participated in staged interrogation sessions where he practiced maintaining consistent stories about American brutality, camp conditions, and his own resistance to enemy psychological warfare. These rehearsals served dual purposes: gathering information while preparing prisoners for the real interrogations they would face at home. Some prisoners expressed genuine fear about returning to North Vietnam, having witnessed American prosperity that made their homeland's poverty seem even more desperate. Pham Van Duc confided to camp counselors that he worried about readjusting to the food shortages, medical inadequacies, and political restrictions that awaited him. The Americans documented these concerns while providing psychological support that eased the transition anxiety. The most psychologically complex aspect involved prisoners who had genuinely been converted by their American experience. Nguyen Thanh Son had embraced democratic ideals, capitalist economics, and individual freedom concepts that made return to communist society feel like entering another form of captivity. American psychologists worked to help him compartmentalize these beliefs, teaching him to maintain internal convictions while displaying external conformity. Repatriation preparation included practical skills for surviving North Vietnamese interrogation techniques that would be far harsher than anything prisoners had experienced in American custody. Former prisoners who had successfully returned provided testimony about communist debriefing methods, torture techniques, and political re-education programs that awaited returnees suspected of ideological contamination. The Americans provided medical documentation that prisoners could use to explain their improved health without revealing the quality of American healthcare. Vaccination records were altered to suggest minimal medical intervention, while dental work was disguised as emergency treatment rather than comprehensive care. These deceptions protected prisoners from suspicion while demonstrating American concern for their post-repatriation welfare. Some prisoners requested to remain in American custody rather than face uncertain reception in North Vietnam. The Americans used these requests as final intelligence opportunities, documenting the psychological impact of their treatment programs while officially denying asylum requests to maintain diplomatic protocols regarding prisoner exchange agreements. The steady rhythm of preparation sessions, psychological conditioning, intelligence debriefing, practical training created final opportunities for American influence while preparing prisoners for the harsh reality that their comfortable captivity was ending. The repatriation process became another weapon in the psychological war, ensuring that returning prisoners carried American influence back into North Vietnamese society while protecting them from the political consequences of having been treated with unexpected humanity by their supposed enemies. The repatriation truck idled at the camp gate, its engine rumbling with mechanical precision that had become as familiar as breathing to the prisoners scheduled for return to North Vietnam. 43 men climbed aboard, their faces showing mixtures of relief, anxiety, and uncertainty about the homeland that awaited them. But Nguyen Van Duc wasn't among them. He stood behind the chain-link fence, watching his former comrades disappear into the distance, having made the most difficult decision of his life: to remain in American custody and request political asylum. The defection process began months before repatriation deadlines, when American intelligence officers quietly approached prisoners who had shown particular enthusiasm for American culture and values. Le Van Minh had been identified as a potential defector after his passionate questions about democratic government during education classes. The approach was subtle: a casual conversation about his post-war plans, gentle probing about his family situation, careful assessment of his psychological readiness to abandon everything he had known. The psychological profile of defectors revealed common characteristics that American analysts had learned to identify. Tran Duc Minh fit the pattern perfectly: intelligent, curious, adaptable, and increasingly disillusioned with communist ideology after witnessing American prosperity firsthand. He had no wife or children in North Vietnam, his parents were deceased, and his brothers had died in combat. These men had fewer emotional anchors pulling them home and more psychological freedom to embrace radical life changes. The decision process proved agonizing, even for prisoners who had embraced American values. Hoang Van Tuan spent sleepless nights weighing his love for his homeland against his newfound understanding of individual freedom and economic opportunity. The choice meant abandoning his culture, language, and identity for an uncertain future in a foreign land, where he would always be an outsider marked by his origins as an enemy soldier. American officials handled defection requests with careful legal precision, ensuring that decisions were voluntary and informed rather than coerced through pressure or false promises. Pham Van Duyck underwent extensive psychological evaluation to confirm his mental stability and genuine commitment to American residency. The process protected both the defector and the American government from later claims of forced conversion or political manipulation. The propaganda value of defections provided enormous strategic advantage to American psychological warfare efforts. Each enemy soldier who chose America over communism became living proof that American values could convert even dedicated communist fighters. These success stories were carefully documented and publicized to demonstrate the superiority of democratic capitalism over communist ideology. Integration programs prepared defectors for civilian life in American society with comprehensive support that exceeded assistance provided to many American veterans. Nguyen Thanh Son received English language training, vocational education, housing assistance, and cultural orientation that helped him navigate the complexities of American bureaucracy, employment systems, and social expectations. The challenges faced by Vietnamese defectors in American society proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Cultural barriers, language difficulties, and subtle discrimination created obstacles that formal support programs couldn't entirely overcome. Some defectors struggled with depression, isolation, and regret about their decision to abandon their homeland for uncertain prospects in an alien culture. Success stories provided inspiration and validation for the defection program's effectiveness. Le Van Minh became a successful small business owner, married an American woman, and raised children who knew nothing of his communist past. His transformation from enemy soldier to American citizen represented the ultimate victory of American values over communist indoctrination. The most psychologically complex cases involved defectors who maintained secret contact with family members in North Vietnam, living double lives that required constant deception about their true circumstances. These men carried the burden of knowing their prosperity came at the cost of permanent separation from loved ones who might face political persecution if their American connections became known. The steady stream of defections, never large in absolute numbers but symbolically significant, created lasting propaganda victories that extended far beyond the individual cases. Each Vietnamese soldier who chose America over communism provided evidence that American psychological operations could achieve what military force alone could never accomplish: the voluntary conversion of enemy hearts and minds through systematic demonstration of superior values, opportunities, and respect for human dignity that made former enemies into grateful American citizens. The train carrying repatriated prisoners pulled into Hanoi Station on a gray morning in 1973. Its passengers bearing invisible cargo more dangerous to the communist regime than any American weapon. Nguyen Van Duyck stepped onto the platform carrying memories of electric lights, abundant food, and medical care that had saved his life. Within weeks, his carefully edited stories would spread through his village like ripples across still water, each telling, creating new questions about the reality of American society versus communist propaganda. The debriefing centers established by North Vietnamese authorities couldn't contain the psychological contamination that returning prisoners brought home. Le Van Minh underwent 3 months of intensive re-education designed to purge American influences from his thinking. But late at night, in whispered conversations with family members, he described flush toilets, air conditioning, and recreational facilities that seemed like fantasies to people who had never seen consistent electricity. Communist interrogators focused on extracting military intelligence while missing the deeper threat posed by prisoners' transformed worldview. Tran Duc Minh provided detailed information about American base locations and troop movements while carefully concealing his admiration for American organizational efficiency, technological sophistication, and respect for individual dignity. The real intelligence he carried home couldn't be tortured out of him because it lived in his changed perspective on what human society could accomplish. Village conversations became inadvertent propaganda sessions as returned prisoners struggled to explain their improved health, expanded knowledge, and subtle changes in attitude. Hoang Van Tuan found himself unconsciously comparing his family's cramped hut to the spacious barracks he had occupied in captivity. His casual mention of daily hot showers created fascination among neighbors who heated water in pots for weekly baths. The medical knowledge that prisoners brought home proved particularly subversive to communist claims about American brutality. Pham Van Duc's survival from wounds that would have been fatal in North Vietnamese military hospitals provided living proof of American medical capabilities. His descriptions of surgical procedures, pharmaceutical treatments, and rehabilitation programs revealed healthcare standards that made North Vietnamese military medicine seem primitive by comparison. Some returned prisoners became informal teachers, sharing practical skills learned during captivity with family members and neighbors. Nguyen Thanh Son taught his brother carpentry techniques that improved their home construction projects. His knowledge of electrical systems, gained through camp work programs, made him valuable to village improvement projects that required technical expertise unavailable through official channels. The psychological impact extended beyond individual families to entire communities that observed changes in returned prisoners' behavior, expectations, and capabilities. Children noticed that their fathers asked different questions, suggested new solutions to old problems, and displayed confidence that hadn't existed before captivity. These subtle transformations influenced the next generation's thinking about possibilities and limitations. Communist authorities attempted to control the narrative by promoting selected prisoners who provided approved testimony about American brutality and their own heroic resistance. But the propaganda campaigns couldn't entirely suppress the cognitive dissonance created by prisoners who had obviously benefited from their captivity experience, rather than suffering the torture and starvation that official stories described. The economic implications proved most threatening to communist ideology. Returned prisoners' descriptions of American abundance, consumer choice, and individual economic opportunity created dangerous comparisons with North Vietnamese scarcity, rationing, and collective poverty. These contrasts raised fundamental questions about the effectiveness of communist economic systems versus capitalist prosperity. Years later, as Vietnam began opening to Western influence, many returned prisoners found themselves uniquely positioned to serve as cultural bridges between Vietnamese and American societies. Their captivity experience provided language skills, cultural knowledge, and personal relationships that proved valuable during diplomatic normalization and economic development programs. The ripple effects continued for decades as children and grandchildren of returned prisoners carried forward subtle influences that shaped their attitudes toward America, democracy, and individual freedom. These generational impacts created long-term psychological victories that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives of the prisoner programs. The most devastating weapon America deployed in Vietnam wasn't napalm or Agent Orange. It was kindness. North Vietnamese prisoners who expected torture received medical care. Soldiers who anticipated starvation discovered abundance. Men who had been taught to hate American brutality instead experienced American generosity that shattered propaganda more effectively than any bomb could destroy buildings. The ultimate lesson echoes through history. Sometimes treating enemies well becomes the most powerful weapon of all.